In the rarefied air of Chicago's Gold Coast, certain family names were not just spoken, they were deployed. They were social currency, legal shields, and weapons of mass influence. The name Wexler was not merely a name, it was a geotag for power. Marcus Wexler, a man who had emerged from the Silicon prairies of the Midwest, had built an empire, Nexus Navigation, on the simple, godlike premise of telling the world exactly where it was and where it was going. His daughter Tiffany, however, had inherited the destination, but not the journey. She was a product of the new digital monarchy, a social media sovereign whose kingdom was built on pixels and whose power was wielded through public scorn. At Aura, a restaurant so exclusive it felt less like a business and more like a curated exhibit of wealth, Tiffany Wexler's reservation was a storm warning. She could eviscerate a Michelin-starred chef's life's work with a 30-second TikTok, branding it tragically basic. She could end a sommelier's career by feigning a coughing fit over a vintage Bordeaux and mockingly asking her 70 million followers if it was supposed to taste of desperation and oak chips. For years she had reigned as the unchallenged queen of this realm of starched linen and whispering waiters, a flawless tyrant in custom-fit Balenciaga. But all tyrannies, especially those built on the shifting sands of public opinion, are fragile, and what happens when a new waitress, a quiet graduate student of historical cartography with a meticulous eye for forgeries, and a life defined by caring for the one man who taught her the difference between a true north and a convenient fiction, begins to see the fraudulent lines not on a map, but in the very foundation of the Wexler family's legacy. This is not a story of simple payback. It is the story of the painstaking, methodical deconstruction of a lie, one carefully observed detail at a time. The atmosphere inside Aura was less an ambiance and more a finely tuned pressure system. It smelled of seared scallops, beeswax from the polished walnut paneling, and the crisp, clean scent of money that has never known a hard day's work. For Ilara Munro, it smelled of survival and a low, humming dread. 6 months ago, she had been a doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago, her days lost in the quiet, dusty archives of the Regenstein Library, writing her dissertation on 17th-century Dutch cartographic watermarks. Her nights were spent at her grandfather's small, book-cluttered apartment, helping him navigate the increasingly treacherous maps of his own memory, his once legendary mind clouded by a creeping neurological decline. A sudden cut in her research funding, and the Everest of her grandfather's medical bills had forced her into this alternate reality. Now, instead of tracing the lineage of master mapmakers, she was memorizing the intricate dietary restrictions of Chicago's elite. She adjusted the constricting knot of her server's tie, a uniform that felt like a costume for a life she had never intended to lead. Her first few weeks were a brutal immersion course in the unspoken bylaws of the super-rich. A glass was not to be refilled until precisely 2/3 empty. A mention of a summer home in Nantucket was a cue to inquire about the regatta schedule. The most critical rule, however, was not printed in the employee handbook. It was delivered in a hushed, grave tone by Antoine, the maître d', a man whose perfectly composed face had seen fortunes made and reputations shattered between the appetizer and the digestive. "See that table in the alcove?" he murmured, his eyes flicking towards it as he straightened an already perfect fork. "Table 4, that is not a table, it is a stage. And the star performs there every Friday." Ellie followed his gaze. Table 4 was nestled in a semi-private alcove, framed by dramatic floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the dining room and the glittering city beyond, while remaining just insulated enough to feel like a VIP box at the opera. "The star is Tiffany Wexler," Antoine said, his voice dropping. He ran a cloth over an invisible speck on the table. "Daughter of Marcus Wexler, Nexus Navigation. The man owns the satellites that tell your phone where you are. His daughter uses that power to tell the world who you are, and it's never a compliment." Ellie knew the name, of course. Marcus Wexler was a Chicago institution, a self-made titan admired for his relentless innovation and, incongruously, his passion for historical artifacts. His daughter, however, was infamous in a thoroughly modern way. Tiffany, known to her followers as Tiff Toxics, was an influencer whose brand was a corrosive blend of aspirational luxury and weaponized contempt. "She is our most high-profile guest," Antoine continued, his expression grim, "and our most volatile. Do not make conversation unless she initiates it. Do not have an opinion on the food, the wine, or the weather. If her phone is pointed in your general direction, you become a piece of furniture. A silent, efficient, invisible piece of furniture. You do not exist." He paused, his gaze meeting hers with unnerving intensity. One perceived slight, one word she decides is cringe, and she will not just complain to me. She will post your face, your name tag, and a 10-second video of your failure to her 70 million followers. She will make you a meme of incompetence. She enjoys it. It's her content. A cold, heavy knot formed in Ellie's stomach. She had faced down arrogant, tenured professors and dismissive archivists, but this was a different species of predator. This was cruelty as a business model. "Is it really that bad?" Ellie asked, her voice a near whisper. Antoine gave a short, mirthless huff of air. "Last spring we had a new sommelier, a young man from France, brilliant kid. He recommended a wine to her, a beautiful Riesling he was very proud of. She tasted it, made a face like she'd just licked a battery, and filmed herself saying, 'OMG, you guys, the sommelier here just tried to serve me this. Does he think I'm a German Hausfrau from 1987? She tagged him. He got death threats. He moved back to Lyon 2 weeks later. She never even learned his name. He was just a prop. The story sent a chill down Ellie's spine. It was the casual annihilation of a person's livelihood for the sake of a few million views. In her studies, she'd read about the capricious power of monarchs who could ruin a courtier with a single glance. It seemed the modern age had simply democratized the audience for the execution. At precisely 9 o'clock, a palpable shift rippled through the restaurant. The hostess's smile became a fraction more rigid, the busboy's movements a little more precise. Tiffany Wexler had arrived. She was not with her father tonight. She was flanked by a pair of sycophants, 2 other young women who looked like they had been assembled from the same catalogue of expensive features. Tiffany was a masterpiece of calculated nonchalance. She wore a liquid silver dress that seemed to defy gravity, and her dark hair was styled in a severe, glossy sheet that fell to her waist. But it was her face that was most striking, impossibly beautiful, yet utterly inert. A mask of bored, aristocratic disdain that only animated when she was performing for the tiny black lens of her phone. She didn't walk through the dining room. She glided, her entourage trailing in her wake like pilot fish. Ellie was assigned the station immediately adjacent to table 4. For the first hour, she moved with the silent focus of a bomb disposal expert. She could hear Tiffany's voice, a high, cutting drawl that sliced through the restaurant's sophisticated hum. She complained that the ice cubes in her water were aggressively square. She sent back her appetizer, a delicate tower of tuna tartar, claiming it looked uninspired. Each complaint was a small assertion of dominance, a public recalibration of the room's power dynamic in her favor. The main event, the true performance, began just before the main course. Ellie's assigned table, a kind-faced older couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, had been utterly charming. As Ellie approached their table to clear their appetizer plates, she was acutely aware of Tiffany's phone turning in her direction. And now, for the main event, Tiffany narrated in a stage whisper to her phone. We get to watch the help at work. Let's see if she can manage to carry 2 plates without having a major life crisis. The suspense is killing me. Ellie's face flushed, but she kept her eyes fixed on her own guests, offering them a small, reassuring smile. She stacked the plates with practiced efficiency and turned to leave. As she passed table 4, Tiffany's voice rang out, sharp and loud. "Oh my God, stop right there!" Ellie froze, her back to Tiffany's table. "Turn around, slowly," Tiffany commanded. Ellie turned, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, panicked rhythm. The entire dining room seemed to have fallen silent. Tiffany was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at her, her face a mask of theatrical outrage. "My bracelet," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with accusation. "My diamond tennis bracelet. It's gone." Her 2 friends gasped in perfect sync. Tiffany gestured to her own slender, now bare wrist. "I was wearing it when I came in. I remember because I filmed a wrist check in the car. It must have fallen off." She then looked directly at Ellie, her eyes narrowing. "Right when you walked past, when you bent over that other table." The implication was as clear as it was venomous. Antoine was at the table in an instant, his face pale. "Miss Wexler, I am certain there is a simple explanation. The explanation is that my $400,000 bracelet is missing, and she was the last person near me," Tiffany snapped, standing up for dramatic effect. Her phone was held high, the red recording light a malevolent eye, capturing every second of Ellie's mortification. "Check her apron," Tiffany demanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a queen ordering a beheading. "I bet you'll find it. People like her see an opportunity." "Miss, I assure you, I would never," Ellie began, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Oh, of course you wouldn't," Tiffany sneered, her lip curling. "Just check the apron, Antoine. Or should I just call my father and have him buy this entire restaurant, just so he can fire all of you personally?" The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Antoine looked at Ellie, his eyes filled with a helpless apology. He knew it was a lie. Everyone knew. But Tiffany Wexler was not a guest. She was a force of nature, and the only choice was to bend or be broken. Humiliated, her face burning as if she'd been slapped, Ellie untied the strings of her crisp white apron. She held it open for Antoine to inspect. The pockets contained a wine key, a pen, and 2 order pads. Nothing else. The room held its breath. For a moment, it seemed Tiffany's vicious play had failed, but she was a master of improvisation. "Oh, how clever," she said with a slow, cruel smile. "She must have dropped it when she realized I saw her. Everyone on your feet. We're going on a treasure hunt." She panned her phone across the horrified faces of the nearby diners. "Tiff Toxics live, you guys. We are live streaming a crime in progress at Aura, Chicago. This waitress. What's your name?" She zoomed in on Ellie's name tag. "Ilara. This Ilara just tried to rob me blind." Then, with a flick of her ankle, she kicked something from under her own chair. A brilliant, glittering string of diamonds skittered across the polished floor, stopping near the edge of Ellie's shoe. "There it is!" Tiffany shrieked triumphantly, as if she had solved a great mystery. She zoomed her camera from the bracelet on the floor to Ellie's stunned, pale face. "Case closed." She panicked and dropped it. "You are the clumsiest, most pathetic thief I have ever seen." The room erupted in a cacophony of shocked whispers. Antoine, his face ashen, saw his career, his restaurant's reputation flashing before his eyes. He looked not at the bracelet, but at Tiffany. He had no choice. "Alara," he said, his voice a choked, hollow sound. "You're fired. Please, just leave. Now." She stood frozen, the collective gaze of the room, a physical weight pressing down on her. She saw pity in some eyes, disgust in others, and in Tiffany's, a victorious, ecstatic gleam. This was her art form, the public vivisection of a person's dignity. Beneath the shock, beneath the tidal wave of shame and injustice, something else began to crystallize in Ellie's chest. It was a cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear rage. In that moment, Tiffany Wexler ceased to be a person and became a complex problem, a fraudulent map that needed to be deconstructed and exposed. And Alara Monroe, the quiet student of historical truths, had just been given all the motivation she would ever need to find the lie. As she was escorted through the kitchen, stripped of her apron, the sound of Tiffany's triumphant laughter echoing behind her, the humiliation began to feel less like a wound and more like a whetstone, sharpening her resolve to a razor's edge. The princess had staged her little passion play. She had no idea she had just declared war on a historian, and historians know that every empire, no matter how glittering, has a fatal flaw in its foundation. The walk home through the cold Chicago night was a fugue state of fury and shame. In the cramped bathroom of her apartment, Ellie stared at her reflection, seeing not a waitress, but a casualty. The video she knew would be everywhere by now. Or a theft. Waitress Gate. Tiff Toxics. Her name and face would be forever linked to this fabricated crime, a digital ghost haunting her future employment prospects. She was jobless. Rent was due. Her grandfather's pharmacy bill sat on the kitchen counter, a stark white testament to her powerlessness. For a long, dark hour, she allowed the despair to wash over her, slumping against the cold tile of the bathroom floor. Revenge felt like an impossible luxury. Survival was the imperative. But as she looked at her own tired, defiant eyes in the mirror, the analytical part of her mind, the part she had spent years honing in dusty archives, began to stir. Outrage was an emotion. Humiliation was a state of being. A lie, however, was a structure, and any structure could be dismantled if you found its load-bearing wall. Tiffany Wexler was a symptom. The power she wielded was the disease, and its source was the untouchable empire of Marcus Wexler. Her grandfather had taught her the first principle of cartography and of life. "To understand the map," he used to say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "you must first understand the surveyor, his tools, his biases, his reasons for drawing the line here and not there. Find the surveyor's first mark, Ellie, his starting point. All else is built upon it." Ellie decided to apply that lesson to the house of Wexler. Her investigation did not begin with a rage-fueled Google search. It began with a memory. She closed her eyes, pushing aside the searing image of the restaurant, and focused. Weeks ago, she had been called in on her day off to serve a private dinner in one of Aura's secluded study rooms. The guest was Marcus Wexler himself. While clearing his dessert plate, she had been captivated by the art on the walls. It was a small, curated collection, but one piece dominated the room. A large, beautifully preserved 16th century map of North America, framed under museum-quality glass. She remembered Wexler gesturing to it while on a phone call. "No, that's not for sale. Not for any price," he'd said, with a rare, soft authority. "That's my true north. It's the cornerstone." The cornerstone. the surveyor's first mark. Ellie sat down at her laptop, the keys clicking in the silent apartment. She ignored the job search websites and opened her university's digital library portal. She began to research the map, a version of the La Proiezione Laurentiana, or Laurentian projection, dated 1569. The official provenance, listed in a decades-old auction catalogue, was flawless. It traced the map's ownership from a Florentine monastery through a series of French aristocrats, its quiet survival through 2 world wars, and its eventual acquisition by a young, hungry Marcus Wexler in the early 1990s. It was the purchase that had supposedly inspired him, a man obsessed with geography, to found Nexus Navigation. It was the artifact that gave his tech empire a soul. But something pricked at the edge of Ellie's mind. Her grandfather, before his illness, had been one of the world's leading experts in authenticating Renaissance-era documents. He had trained her eye, teaching her to see beyond the image to the object itself. He'd taught her about the chemical composition of iron gall ink, the subtle striations in vellum made from calfskin versus sheepskin, the almost imperceptible hesitation in a forger's line as they tried to replicate a master's confident stroke. She pulled up high-resolution images of the Wexler map, cross-referencing them with authenticated maps from the same period in the university's archives. She spent hours, the city lights coming on outside her window, her eyes burning from the screen's glow. She compared the calligraphy, the coastlines, the elaborate cartouches. And then she saw it. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail, something that only a person who had spent 1,000 hours staring at such things would ever notice. In the vast, empty expanse representing the Pacific Ocean, the cartographer had drawn a series of elaborate sea monsters. One of them, a serpentine beast with a magnificent crest, was colored with a particularly vivid, luminous green. The official catalogue described the medium as tempera on vellum. But that green, it had a specific, almost artificial brilliance. Drawing on her thesis research, she ran a digital spectroscopic analysis based on the high-resolution photograph, comparing the light refraction properties of the pigment to a database she had helped build. The green on the sea monster showed trace reflective signatures consistent with Scheele's green, an arsenic-based pigment known for its vibrant hue. The problem? Scheele's green was invented in 1775. It was an anachronism, a single, impossible fleck of color that had no right to exist on a map, supposedly created 2 centuries earlier. Ellie's breath hitched. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat of discovery. This wasn't a cataloging error. This was a smoking gun. She ran the analysis again, then cross-referenced the map's watermarks with known Florentine paper mills of the 1560s. They didn't match. They were closer to watermarks used by a notorious 19th-century forger named Luigi Fiorini. Marcus Wexler's True North, the foundational myth of his entire empire, the symbol of his authentic, visionary genius, was a fake. A brilliant, stunningly beautiful, but undeniable forgery. She leaned back in her chair, the sheer scale of the discovery washing over her. This was not a piece of gossip. This was an existential threat to a global brand. The financial implications were staggering, but the damage to Marcus Wexler's legacy, to his carefully crafted narrative of authenticity, would be apocalyptic. It was the kind of secret that could level a skyscraper. The question was, what was she going to do with it? This knowledge was a weapon of immense power. She could leak it to a journalist, igniting a firestorm that would consume the Wexler name. She could destroy Marcus Wexler's reputation, just as his daughter had destroyed hers. But as she looked at the worn photograph of her grandfather on her desk, she knew it wasn't that simple. Her grandfather had admired Marcus Wexler, not for his wealth, but for his supposed reverence for history. "He's a new king with an old soul," he had once said. To simply blow up the man's life felt like a betrayal of the very principles her grandfather had taught her, a respect for the truth, no matter how complex. No, a public explosion was Tiffany's method. It was loud, messy, and designed for maximum collateral damage. Ellie's approach would have to be different. It would be quiet, precise, and as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She wouldn't just expose a fraud. She would use the truth to rebalance the scales, to seek not revenge, but a very specific and far more profound form of justice. The girl with the eye for detail had found the lie at the heart of the empire. Now she just had to figure out how to present it to the king himself. Possessing a secret of this magnitude was one thing, deploying it was another. Ellie couldn't just call the executive offices of Nexus Navigation. An anonymous email would be deleted by a low-level assistant. She needed a stage, a moment of direct confrontation where Marcus Wexler couldn't dismiss her or have her removed by security. For 3 days, Ellie used her academic research skills to do a deep dive, not on maps, but on Marcus Wexler's schedule. She found her opening in a small announcement on the University of Chicago's alumni website. In 1 week, Wexler was giving a rare, intimate Q&A session for the graduate students of the history department, a fireside chat about the intersection of technology and historical preservation. Attendance was limited. Security would be tight, but for students of the department, not impenetrable. She spent the next week preparing, not for an ambush, but for a dissertation defense. She compiled her evidence into a slim, professional-looking folio. Magnified high-resolution images of the map, side-by-side comparisons of the calligraphy with known Fiorini forgeries, the spectroscopic data on the shield's green pigment, and a meticulously cited paper on the map's fraudulent provenance. She was not an angry ex-waitress seeking revenge. She was a scholar presenting her findings. The night of the event, Ellie dressed in the only professional outfit she owned, a simple dark grey blazer and slacks. She wore her hair pulled back and carried a leather satchel that held her folio and a university-issued notepad. She looked every bit the serious, slightly intimidated graduate student. The lecture hall was a warm, wood-panelled room filled with the eager, intelligent faces of her peers and professors. Ellie took a seat in the back, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Marcus Wexler took the stage. He was not the imposing titan she had expected. He was of average height, with a restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He spoke with a surprising humility about his childhood love for old maps, about how they represented a snapshot of human knowledge and human error. "My most prized possession," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, unfeigned passion, "is a 1569 Laurentian map. To me, it's not just an object. It's a reminder that even with all our satellites and algorithms, we are all just trying to chart a course based on the best information we have. It's about the search for truth. For a true north, that's the cornerstone of everything we do at Nexus." Ellie felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He believed it. He had built his life on a lie, but he was not the author of it. After the talk, as students crowded around him, asking questions about internships and data modeling, Ellie knew it was her only chance. She waited for a lull, for the crowd to thin. As he was preparing to leave, flanked by 2 imposing security guards, she approached. "Mr. Wexler?" He turned, his eyes giving her a polite, dismissive scan. He was about to brush her off when she spoke her next words, her voice low but clear. "My name is Ilara Monroe. I'm a doctoral candidate specializing in Renaissance cartographic authentication. I have some urgent findings regarding the provenance of your 1569 Laurentian map that I believe you need to see." The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous. The friendly philanthropist vanished, replaced by the shrewd, calculating CEO. The words cartographic authentication and provenance were keys that unlocked a door deep inside him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a flicker of something, not recognition of her face, but of her seriousness, registered in his eyes. "My findings are confidential and sensitive," she added, holding his gaze. "They concern the work of a 19th century forger named Luigi Fiorini." The name landed like a well-aimed stone. Wexler's face, which had been open and avuncular, tightened into a mask of sharp, analytical focus. He knew the scent of a real threat, and it didn't smell like a disgruntled student. It smelled like meticulously researched fact. "Walk with me," he said, the words clipped. He gestured for his security to give them space, and led her out of the lecture hall into a small, empty conference room down the hall. The room was sterile and silent, a stark contrast to the warm wood of the hall. The air hummed with the faint sound of the building's ventilation. Marcus Wexler did not sit. He stood by the large window, his back to the city lights, his face cast in shadow. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice stripped of all warmth. Ellie opened her folio on the polished conference table, the documents stark under the cold fluorescent lights. The world outside seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them, the silence, and the evidence of a 400-year-old lie. She did not speak of Aura. She did not speak of his daughter. She did not speak of a diamond bracelet. She spoke only of history, of science, of fact. "The vellum, Mr. Wexler," she began, her voice the steady, detached tone of a scholar. "It shows traces of chemical bleaching agents not developed until the mid-1800s, used to artificially age the material." She pointed to a magnified image. "The iron gall ink used for the calligraphy is inconsistent. The iron-to-tannin ratio is characteristic of recipes used by Fiorini, designed to mimic 16th century ink, but lacking the characteristic browning of authentic period documents under ultraviolet light." She turned a page. The quiet rustle of the paper was the only sound. "And this is the definitive proof." She laid the final document on the polished mahogany, the spectrographic analysis of the sea monster's green crest. "The pigment contains copper astoarsenite, Scheele's green, invented in 1775. It is a chemical and historical impossibility on a map dated 1569. This isn't a copy, Mr. Wexler. It is a deliberate, masterfully executed forgery, most likely created by Luigi Fiorini in the 1880s. Her voice was a scalpel, precise and bloodless, performing a clinical dissection of his life's foundational myth. Each word, each piece of evidence, was another cut, severing the narrative he had so carefully constructed, the tech savant with the soul of a Renaissance explorer. Marcus Wexler did not move. He stood as if rooted to the floor, a statue of a powerful man. But Ilara, trained to see the subtle watermarks beneath the surface, saw the tremor in his hand, the faint twitch of a muscle below his eye. He was not looking at the documents. He was staring through them into a chasm that had just opened at his feet. The silence in the sterile conference room was no longer empty. It was a roaring vacuum, sucking the air from his lungs, the color from his face. He had built an empire on the godlike certainty of telling the world exactly where it was. Now he was adrift, his own coordinates erased, his true north revealed as a painted lie. He finally walked to the table, his movements stiff, robotic. His fingers, which could command global markets with a few keystrokes, hovered over the high-resolution image of the fraudulent map as if it were radioactive. He was not seeing ink and vellum. He was seeing the face of the art dealer in Geneva, 30 years younger, so earnest and convincing. He was seeing the proud moment he'd hung it in his first real office, a symbol of his ascent. He was seeing the countless journalists and business partners to whom he had pontificated, gesturing at the map as he spoke of authenticity, of vision, of the immutable truths that guide great enterprises. The entire architecture of his public self was built on this cornerstone, and this quiet, unassuming young woman had just informed him it was made of sand. His gaze lifted, moving from the folio to her face. It was a slow, heavy movement, like a security camera panning to identify a threat. The initial shock was now hardening into something else, the cold, dangerous calculus of a cornered predator. He was searching his memory, not for her name, but for her angle. Everyone had an angle. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, stripped of its usual charismatic timbre. "Was it Ellison? That vulture from Omnidata? Is this corporate espionage?" "No one sent me," Ilara replied, her composure unwavering. She had anticipated this. The powerful never believe they are undone by the small. They look for an equal and opposite force, another king on the chessboard. "Then what is this?" he demanded, a flicker of his old authority returning. "A shakedown? You come in here, a graduate student with a folder full of accusations. What's the number? How much to make this research disappear?" This was the moment. The crossroads. She could name a price that would solve all her problems, a number that would make the humiliation at Aura a distant, laughable memory. But the thought was hollow, tasteless. Money was his language, his tool, the solvent he used to dissolve inconvenient truths. To accept it would be to validate his worldview, to become just another problem he had paid to go away. It would be a betrayal of her grandfather, of the very principles that had led her here. "My grandfather has a neurodegenerative disease," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more piercing. "His memory is fragmented. Some days he's a brilliant historian, and some days he doesn't know my name. But even on his worst days, he has more integrity in his little finger than your daughter has in her entire body." The non sequitur struck Wexler with the force of a physical blow. His face, which had been a mask of controlled fury, slackened into confusion. "My daughter? What does Tiffany have to do with any of this?" "A few nights ago, at a restaurant called Aura," Ilara stated, her voice returning to its dispassionate, factual tone. "Your daughter falsely accused me of stealing her $400,000 bracelet. She did it for sport. She filmed my public degradation and firing for her 70 million followers. She did it because she is a person of profound, malignant emptiness, a forgery of a human being who can only feel real when she is destroying something real in others." She let the words hang in the air, connecting the two disparate threads, the fraudulent map on his wall and the fraudulent soul he had raised. "You have spent a lifetime, Mr. Wexler, building an empire on what you believed was an authentic foundation. You cherished that map because you thought it was true. Your daughter, on the other hand, actively manufactures lies. She creates false narratives to ruin lives for entertainment. One is a tragedy of deception. The other is a celebration of it. The poison from the fruit of your family tree is now leaking into the world." He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't corporate espionage. This wasn't blackmail. This was a reckoning. It was something far more ancient and terrifying. A grievance. "What do you want?" he asked again. But the words were different now. They were hollowed out, devoid of power. He was no longer a CEO assessing a threat. He was a father and a fool, standing before a judge he didn't know he had appointed. "I want you to understand the nature of the debt you owe," Ilara said, her gaze as steady as a surveyor's mark. "It is not a debt to me. I am just a symptom. Your debt is to the idea of truth itself, the very concept you claim to value. Your house is built on a lie, Mr. Wexler. And I'm not talking about the one that was hanging on your wall." She closed her folio, the sound a soft, final click in the silent room. "You have my findings. What you do with them, with the truth, is now up to you." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Marcus Wexler alone with the ghost of his legacy and the quiet, damning evidence of its fraudulence. The hours after Ilara left were a blur of pure, unadulterated freefall for Marcus Wexler. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't call his security chief. He dismissed his driver and walked. For 3 hours he walked the grid of Chicago, the city his technology had mapped to the inch, and felt utterly, terrifyingly lost. The soaring steel and glass towers of his peers seemed to mock him, their foundations solid, their histories unimpeachable. His own felt like a Hollywood set, a beautiful facade with nothing behind it. He finally arrived at his penthouse, a sterile expanse of white marble and glass overlooking the dark, glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. The first thing he did was walk to his private study. There it was, the Laurentian map, his true north. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning, majestic, mysterious, ancient. But now he could see it. He could see the lie. The green on the sea monster, once a charming detail, now pulsed with a sickening, anachronistic vibrancy. The confident lines of the coast seemed to shiver with the forger's deceit. With a surge of cold, clarifying rage, he took the heavy frame off the wall. The security alarm, calibrated for the slightest vibration, shrieked through the penthouse. He ignored it, carrying the map to the center of the room and laying it on the floor. He stared down at it. This beautiful, expensive lie he had loved for 30 years. It had been his muse, his justification. He had used its story to define himself. And in doing so, he had allowed himself to ignore the far more dangerous forgery he was cultivating under his own roof. Ilara Monroe's words echoed in the silent room. A forgery of a human being. He had given Tiffany everything, money, access, freedom from all consequence. He had mistaken her follower count for influence, her cruelty for strength, her brand for a business. He had watched her casual demolitions of others from a distance, telling himself it was the currency of her generation, a world he didn't fully understand. He had funded the creation of a monster and then applauded her for roaring. The shrieking alarm was finally silenced remotely by his security team, who were now calling his phone with frantic urgency. He ignored the calls. He knew what he had to do. Tiffany was not at home. She was, according to her live Instagram story, at a private club, celebrating her victory over the thieving proletariat. He drove there himself. When he walked into the pulsing, velvet-draped room, the sea of young, beautiful, vacant faces parted before him. His presence was a cataclysm, a god from another world descending into their vapid Olympus. He found Tiffany in a VIP booth, holding court, her phone held high as she narrated her own fabulousness. She saw him, and her face lit up with a brilliant, false smile. "Daddy, what a surprise! Everyone, look, the legend himself has graced us with his presence," she announced to her phone. Marcus walked to her, took the phone from her hand, and ended the live stream. He then turned to her entourage of sycophants. "Leave," he said. It was not a request. They scattered like startled birds. "Hey, I was creating content," Tiffany protested, her voice a spoiled whine. "The content is over," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The performance is finished." He sat down opposite her in the booth, the club's deafening music, a strange, throbbing backdrop to the quiet execution he was about to perform. "I met the waitress from Aura tonight," he began. "Her name is Alara Monroe." Tiffany rolled her eyes. "Ugh, is she still crying about it? Did she come to you for money? So pathetic. I already had my team scrub the video. It was getting boring anyway." "She didn't want money," Marcus said, leaning forward. "She wanted me to see the truth. She is a scholar of historical cartography, a specialist in authenticating antique maps." A flicker of confusion crossed Tiffany's face. "Maps? What are you talking about?" "The Laurentian map," Marcus said. "The one in my study, my true north." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "It's a fake, a 19th century forgery, a brilliant, expensive, and utterly fraudulent piece of work." Tiffany stared at him, uncomprehending. "Okay, so get a new one. Sue the guy who sold it to you. Why are you telling me this in the middle of a party?" And there it was, the profound, unbridgeable chasm between them. She saw an object, a bad investment. He saw the collapse of a universe. "Because she used it as a metaphor, Tiffany," he said, his voice cracking with a pain so deep it shocked him. "She came to me with this devastating truth, this demolition of my own identity for one reason only: to make me understand what it feels like to have your reality publicly dismantled for sport, to make me understand what you did to her." He leaned closer, his eyes boring into hers. "She held up a mirror to my fraudulent map to show me my fraudulent daughter." For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through Tiffany's bored facade, sheer, unadulterated rage. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you compare me to some dusty old piece of paper? I am a brand. I have 70 million followers who hang on my every word. I built an empire." "No," Marcus said, the word landing with the finality of a gavel. "I built an empire. You built a cage of smoke and mirrors that I paid for. And now the funding is cut. The show is over." He stood up. "Your credit cards will be declined by morning. The lease on your apartment will not be renewed. The trust fund your grandfather left you is being liquidated, and the entire principal is being transferred into an endowment. You are, for the first time in your 26 years, on your own. You want to be a brand? Fine. Go see what your market value is when you have nothing to sell but your own character." He turned and walked away, leaving her sitting alone in the VIP booth, her mouth agape, the triumphant narrative of her evening and her life, shattering into a million unshareable pieces. For 8 days, Alara lived in a state of suspended animation. She had detonated a nuclear device at the heart of the Wexler Empire and then simply walked away. The silence that followed was terrifying. Every black car that passed her apartment building sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Every unknown number on her phone was a potential threat. She had poked the dragon, and now she waited for the fire. She spent her days at her grandfather's bedside, the quiet rhythm of the care facility a strange comfort. She read to him from old books on celestial navigation, his hand limp in hers. He was having a bad week, lost in the fog of his illness, but his presence was a grounding force. He was her true north, and he was fading. The thought that she might have ruined her own future and her ability to care for him, for a principle that now felt abstract and reckless, was a constant, gnawing fear. On the 9th day, she received an email. The sender was simply Emt Wexler. The subject line was a meeting. The body of the message was a single line. The Regenstein Library. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The map room. The choice of location was a clear signal. He wasn't summoning her to his tower. He was coming to her ground, to the heart of her world. She arrived the next morning to find him already there. He was not flanked by security. He was alone, standing before a large display case containing a 15th century portolan chart. He looked older, diminished, as if he had aged a decade in the last week. He wore a simple grey sweater, not a bespoke suit. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a tired professor on sabbatical. "Miss Monroe," he said, turning to her. His eyes were clear, but shadowed with a profound exhaustion. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Wexler," she replied, her voice cautious. "I did what you suggested," he said, his gaze returning to the ancient map in the case. "I looked at the fraud in my own house. It was more deeply rooted than I could have ever imagined." He spoke of his confrontation with Tiffany, not with anger, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "I realized I hadn't raised a daughter. I had curated a brand. I'd given her a platform, but no foundation. A stage, but no script worth reading." He turned to face her fully. "That night, you didn't just expose a forgery. You exposed me to myself, the man who built a navigation empire and yet failed to chart a moral course for his own child." He gestured to the maps surrounding them, the quiet, patient work of centuries. "For 30 years I collected these. I saw them as assets, as symbols of my own vision. I never truly understood what they were. They aren't just pictures of the world. They are acts of courage, an attempt, however flawed, to render the unknown known, to create a shared truth where before there was only speculation and fear." He paused, and Elara felt the air shift. This was not an apology. It was a preamble to something else entirely. "I am dismantling my daughter's public persona, but that's not restitution. It's just damage control. A debt is still owed. Not to you, as you said, but to the truth." He looked her directly in the eye. "I am establishing a new foundation. Its sole purpose will be to seek out, preserve, and authenticate historical truths, to fund the underfunded, to provide resources for libraries, museums, and archives that are the custodians of our collective memory, to fight back against the modern tide of convenient fictions and disposable realities." He took a step closer. "But a foundation is just money and a name. It needs a conscience. It needs a director who has an unassailable eye for the truth and, more importantly, the courage to speak it, regardless of the consequences. It needs a true north." Elara's heart was pounding. She had expected a job offer, a way to be neatly folded into the Nexus corporate structure, a gilded cage of gratitude. This was something else. "I am not offering you a job, Miss Monroe," he said. "I am asking you to be my partner. The foundation will be called the Monroe Wexler Foundation for Historical Integrity. Your name first. You will have absolute autonomy. The endowment will be the entirety of Tiffany's former trust. Your mission will be to use my resources to protect the things your grandfather taught you to value. I will provide the capital. You will provide the character." She was speechless. This wasn't a payoff. It was an abdication, a transfer of power. He wasn't trying to buy her silence. He was trying to amplify her voice. He was taking the two things that defined him, his name and his money, and placing them in her hands, asking her to build something real from the ruins of his fake legacy. She thought of the humiliation in the restaurant, the smug, victorious look on Tiffany's face. She had wanted justice. She had never imagined it would look like this. Not a punishment, but a repurposing. The very wealth that had fueled Tiffany's cruelty would now be used to fund the preservation of truth. It was a justice so poetic, so precise, it took her breath away. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a whisper. "Why trust me with this?" Marcus Wexler looked at the ancient map, at its faded coastlines and confident, hand-drawn monsters. "Because you were the only person in 30 years who wasn't afraid to tell me my map was a lie. In my world, that makes you the most valuable person I have ever met." 1 year later, Ilara stood on the sun-drenched patio of the North Shore Neurological Care Center. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees overhead. Beside her, in a wheelchair, sat her grandfather. He was having a good day, a rare, lucid day. His eyes were clear, and he had recognized her the moment she walked in, a small, treasured miracle. She placed a large, leather-bound folio on his lap. "I wanted to show you the Foundation's first project," she said softly. He opened it with his gnarled, trembling hands. Inside were stunning, high-resolution photographs of the restored archives of the Chicago Public Library's historical branch. Decades of water damage and neglect, funded by the Monroe Wexler Foundation's first grant, had been meticulously repaired. Maps that were crumbling to dust were now preserved. Documents that were illegible were now readable. Her grandfather traced a finger over a photograph of a newly restored 1893 map of the city. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. "The surveyor's mark," he murmured, his voice a faint echo of its former strength. "You found it, Ellie. You always find the first mark." He didn't know the whole story. He didn't know about Tiffany, or Aura, or the forged Laurentian map, but he understood the image in front of him. He saw a broken thing that had been made whole. He saw a truth that had been saved from oblivion. Ilara put her hand over his. In the distance, the skyline of Chicago shimmered in the afternoon light, a city of soaring, audacious structures, an empire of glass and steel built by men like Marcus Wexler. But here, in the quiet shade of an oak tree, was the beginning of a different kind of empire. It was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more real. It wasn't built on satellites or stock prices. It was built on the patient, painstaking work of telling the truth, of calling things by their proper names. She had not torn down a king's castle. She had simply shown him where his foundations were weak, and then helped him find the bedrock on which to build again.